You're listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. Today, we share a special presentation that John Stonestreet gave to Summit Ministries. Summit Ministries desires to see generations of Christians mobilized to transform a broken world. They exist to equip and support rising generations to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. They offer 2-week conferences for high school and college students, online and in Colorado and in Georgia. During COVID, they offered a special Summit Base Camp for parents and teens to help equip them in the changing culture. John Stonestreet gave a special presentation on religious freedom at Summit Base Camp. I'm excited to share with you his presentation. Stick around at the end of this presentation, and I'd like to tell you more about Summit Ministries. Here's John Stonestreet.
My job tonight is really, what I want to do is accomplish two things in addition to defining religious liberty, because we got to define our terms, more on that in just a second. But I want to talk about, really make the case for two things. Number one, that religious liberty and the loss and the threats to religious liberty are indeed a significant issue, not just for Christians, but for the larger cultural moment in which we're in. In other words, there's a lot at stake when it comes to this question of religious freedom, the space that's afforded for religious freedom in the larger cultural space and so on. And then the second thing is, I think, a really important thing. This seems, for many of us, to be an issue that's kind of come out of nowhere. But one of the things that we talk about in the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, which was given away just a second ago, is that culture's like water. It's like the water in which we swim. And you can think about this in two ways. One is, if you've ever been at the beach and you got hit by a wave, you felt it. You know it hit you. And there's a lot of these challenges to religious liberty that are hitting us like waves. And so we sense that it kind of came out of nowhere because it kind of feels that way. Things that were taken for granted yesterday are now completely up in the air today. And things that were unthinkable yesterday are unquestionable today. But you may have also had this experience at the beach where you've been there, maybe your kids, you get there, your kids run out into the water and you're kind of setting your towel up or your chair and you look up and they were just right there, but they're not there anymore. And you have this kind of mini heart attack and then you realize they've just kind of drifted, 20 yards this way or 20 yards this way. They didn't get hit by a wave. They were taken there by what? A current, an undercurrent. And so the waves that are hitting us right now when it comes to the threats to religious liberty, the decreasing space afforded for religious liberty in our culture are actually created by much deeper undercurrents that have been at work for a really long time. And I got to be honest, these aren't things that I've always seen. I'm the president of an organization called the Colson Center, named after the late, great Chuck Colson. One of the last things that he put together was a statement. It was in 2009. Chuck passed away in 2012. But in 2009, Chuck worked with one of the eminent Catholic moral philosophers of our day, Dr. Robert George, one of the great theologians of our day, a Baptist, Dr. Timothy George, to put together a statement called the Manhattan Declaration. And this was a statement on life, marriage, and religious liberty. It was essentially a call to hold the line. It wasn't a call for the culture to change. It was a call for the church to be very, very clear on some essentials when it came to our cultural witness and the way that we approached the larger world around us. And I remember back in 2009, I had the privilege to be at some of the early meetings where these things were being discussed. And I remember thinking, yeah, life, of course, Roe v. Wade, the challenge of abortion, late-term abortion, increasingly medical abortions. Yeah, that's a huge issue, and we still haven't settled that after, several decades. Of course, that's a line that we've got to hold. And of course, we were also looking ahead towards things like doctor-assisted suicide, which Colorado, where we're at tonight, is one of the states that's legalized that. Of course, life is a huge issue. Marriage. Yeah, this was in the early days of really talking about same-sex marriage. This was the time in which states were passing state-level referendum to define marriage as between a man and a woman. And the courts were very often, at least the federal or the district courts, were just overturning those and mandating same-sex marriage in state after state. And it was headed towards what we would know to be the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court, which created the so-called right to same-sex marriage across America. Of course, that's a big issue, marriage. But I remember being in that meeting and seeing that third item on the list, religious freedom, and thinking, really? I mean, this is America. This is really going to be one of the things that matter the most in the coming years? And I should have known better then, and I certainly know better now than to doubt what Chuck Colson suggested in any sort of prophetic sense, because he always seemed in many ways to be right. But he got this one exactly right. In fact, over the course of this evening, you're going to hear names of people who realize just how critical the issue of religious liberty is. You're going to hear names like Blaine Adamson and Barronelle Stutzman. You're going to hear of a 9-year-old girl in Mississippi whose religious freedoms are being threatened by an overactive school superintendent. You're going to hear about our good friend Jack Phillips, just not too far from here, who's been in a 10-year battle protecting his rights to not have to express messages that he disagrees with. You're going to hear about a group of nuns forced to, or at least where the government attempted to force them to buy contraception, put that one together. You're going to hear about a whole lot of these names. And what I want us to understand is that these names represent that, these names tell us that this issue of religious liberty is more than just an issue. One of the mantras of Summit Ministries, a statement that goes way back, is a line that we often say at the Colson Center as well, and that's ideas have consequences. And what I always like to add to that is kind of chapter 2, which is ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. And the victims, the names that you're going to hear through the course of this evening from myself, from Dr. Myers, from others, are victims of our bad ideas about what religion is and where religion fits in the world. In the years after Chuck Colson helped put together this document called the Manhattan Declaration, which highlighted religious freedom as an issue that we should care about as Christians, our good friend Os Guinness, who of course writes, I think, a book a year because he's ridiculous like that, somewhere around 2010, he put together, I think, a book called A Free People's Suicide. So this is just a couple years later, in which he also foresaw the coming threats to the religious freedom. Now, when I was looking at the Manhattan Declaration going, is this really a big deal? Part of it is because, hey, religious freedom, I mean, that's as American as apple pie and baseball, right? I mean, is that really going to be, I mean, can that actually be under threat? It's one of the identifying parts of America's DNA. But Oz, like Chuck, saw that there was a collision happening, a coming collision that was going to threaten religious liberty. He saw 3 heads to this collision, 3 factors that were happening culturally that were going to threaten religious liberty in the days ahead. The first that Oz pointed out was the ongoing global struggle with Islam, especially radical Islam. Now, what was happening there is what you were seeing in other parts of the world is the consequences of a religious fanaticism. And what Oz saw and what he believed is that what was going to happen is that not just Islamic radicalism or fanaticism was going to get a bad reputation for being bad for society, but that it was actually going to be transferred. The guilt of Islamic radicalism was going to be transferred to any religious radicalism. In fact, you can kind of think this through if you think about how the word fundamentalism has changed. The word fundamentalism went from the early part of the 20th century to refer to a group of Christians to, after the early part of the 21st century, to refer specifically to Muslim fundamentalists. And now, of course, what we've seen is that transfer has actually happened, that the guilt is not this particular kind of religious fanaticism grounded in a worldview such as Islam that has its issues and problems and sees the world completely different than Christianity. It's the fanaticism itself. It's the religious conviction itself that's bad. More on that in just a second. The second thing that Oz pointed to was not just this global conflict with Islam, but that there was a growing acceptance of critiquing religion in the public square in general. Now, when he was writing this book, there was a group of people you might remember called the New Atheists: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. And the distinctives there wasn't that they were saying anything new, and that was kind of the irony of the New Atheists. They were just saying things that were really old, but that it was becoming increasingly accepted to denigrate in mockery and in argument Christianity in particular, but religion in general, as being not just outdated and not even just stupid, but maybe bad for the world. Now, of course, that was at that time the challenge having to do, with the new atheism. I don't think even Guinness had foreseen kind of where we're at right now, where anything old in the name of being woke, in the name of being kind of on the side of social justice, being on the side of kind of the radical revolution that so many, particularly young people in America, think need to happen, that basically anything old now is being grouped into a category of just being wrong, just being bad, just being dangerous. And so it's now become not only accepted to criticize religion itself, or certain parts of religious morality itself, but if you don't criticize old school religious morality, then you're not woke enough, and you might lose, a spot on a particular television show, or a pension, or a job, or maybe a degree program, or something like that. So that acceptance of being critical of religion has certainly become an issue, just like Oz said it would. The third thing, and this is the thing that we probably are most familiar with over the last couple years, the thing that feels most like the waves that are just pounding us, is that Oz talked about the collision, and that the collision would only get worse between religious freedom and sexual freedom. The most successful revolution of our lifetime, maybe the most successful revolution of Western culture, and in terms of being so successful in changing so many aspects of our life, so many norms, so many different segments of society, has been the sexual revolution. And the sexual revolution, and this is critical, the sexual revolution is not just a moral revolution. It's not just a revolution in which certain things that were once considered wrong are now considered right, and things that were once considered right are now considered wrong, and that's what's been, that's what's changed because of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is at root a anthropological revolution. I know that's a big word for this late at night. Here's what I mean. It's not just a revolution of how we ought to behave and what's considered right and wrong in our behavior. The sexual revolution is a revolution of what we mean when we say the word human. The most significant shift that's happened in the last several decades in America has not been a moral shift. The moral shift we've seen has been not the root, it's been the fruit. The deeper shift is a shift in what we think it means to be human. So the sexual revolution has successfully redefined what it means to be human. And that's going to be in direct conflict with an idea like religious liberty. You can actually see this if you look back into our founding documents. You know this line, everybody knows this line from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. That all are created equal. Now, I like to do this when there's a big group in a room, and we can't really do it, but you can think about this virtually. Imagine you're back in a big group or on a plane, and you look around. Is it self-evident that we're equal? No. The most self-evident thing is not that we're the same. The most self-evident thing is that we are what? Different. And the founders believed, though, it was self-evident that we were equal. Well, if that's the case, it can't be based on anything that we share on the outside, because we don't share anything on the outside. Some are taller than others, some are older than others, some are male, some are female, some have this skin pigment, some have that skin pigment. The only thing that can be self-evident is an assumption that we share something in our common humanity, not externally, but intrinsically. Not something that we do or something that we look like or some capacity that we have, but that we share what it means to be human. And that's got to be based on something non-physical, something that's actually, how's the document go on? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are what? Endowed by their what? Creator. The sexual revolution has successfully taken that category of the human person, that we are created individuals, and from that creation, we are who we are, and we have some sort of shared identity, and has tried to locate our identity into our sexual urges, our sexual inclinations, and our sexual behavior. That means what it means, and where that's going to lead is that what it means for us to be truly and fully human is going to mean completely different things to different segments of the population. So all of those ideas are in the water way upstream and are creating this current challenge that we have that's expressing itself in this conflict over religious freedom and the place of religion in the public square. And what does it mean to have rights and privileges? And are rights the same things as privileges? All these debates that are happening in our culture are consequences of ideas that are cultural first and foremost, not legal. Now, all the conflicts we're having, of course, are we see them in all kinds of different segments of culture. In fact, one of the most significant chapters in the history of the sexual revolution, when this conflict that Os Guinness wrote about between sexual freedom and religious liberty really hit a head, you can actually put a date to it. It was somewhere around 2014, 2015 in the state of Indiana. You see, back in the 90s, a bipartisan effort existed to pass something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This was actually passed under President Clinton, led by Ted Kennedy. And it was this effort, and it ended up taking the form of state by state by state, as well as a national, what we call a RFRA, to basically elevate religious freedom to the place that it was in the Constitution. Or the Bill of Rights. There's a reason it's called the first freedom. It's in the very first understanding of what it means to be a citizen in the American context. And Dr. Myers is going to talk more about this in just a second. This was a non-controversial thing in the 90s. Completely passed unanimously. I think it actually, I don't think there was a single dissenting vote, if I remember correctly. Around 2014, as some challenges continued to emerge from the sexual revolution, some of the states decided to pass state-level RFRA to settle state-level problems. One of those was the state of Indiana. What happened in the state of Indiana when they attempted to pass a RFRA legislation for that state was that suddenly a new segment of culture that had been previously untouched, or at least sitting out of the sexual revolution, completely got involved. Now, you can look and say, look, the ideas of the sexual revolution, whether we're talking about, trivializing marriage, changing our moral views about sex outside of marriage and everything else, that stuff goes back. I mean, it's been in the arts, it's been in education, it's been in all kinds of different segments of culture. Many people look at culture in terms of segments, like there's 7 mountains or 7 segments, and you could say that arts and education and even some political areas were really, leveraged when it comes to the sexual revolution in different ways. But what happened in Indiana in 2014 is suddenly the business community kicked in. And the pressure that the business community put on the then governor of Indiana and the other political leaders of Indiana was something we had not yet seen. And now, of course, X number of years later, we have what's called woke capitalism. where the religious freedom challenges that we have are deeper than just the laws that are passed or the rules that change from one president to the next, one president creating space for religious conviction, the other president, changing the rule of a particular policy or something and really squeezing it in. It's even bigger than just what the Supreme Court decides in some of these high-profile cases like Obergefell or the Bostock decision in the last term. It is a culture-wide conversation right now about whether religious conviction is itself a good thing or is itself a bad thing. Whether religious conviction has a place in the way we order our public lives. In other words, this is not just a problem that's created in politics. It's not even a problem that's created in the courts, which means it's not a problem that can be solved by politics. One of Chuck Colson's favorite quotes was, "Salvation will never come in Air Force One." And that's still as true today as it's ever been. And it's especially true when it comes to religious freedom. There's a larger cultural shift that has been taking place for years now that's leading to the conflicts that are front and center on many of our hearts and minds. Now, what I want to do here with the few minutes that I have left is really lock in on defining religious freedom, because that's actually where half the battle is making sure we know what religious freedom is. And there are two primary ways in the American context right now that religious freedom is misunderstood. The historic way that it's misunderstood is also an observation that I completely owe to Chuck Colson. In fact, I remember I have the privilege right now of doing a daily commentary that he started called Breakpoint, and I remember reading a Breakpoint that he put out probably somewhere around 2009, maybe 2010, in which he noted that a particular leader in that presidential administration at the time had stopped using the language of freedom of religion and had started using the language of freedom of worship. And he thought that that was a big deal. And again, I looked at it and said, I don't know if that's such a big deal. And again, he was right. Because what he noted was freedom of worship is not the same thing as freedom of religion at all. And what we have seen since then is that his observation was exactly right. And that one of the most common misunderstandings of religious freedom is to reduce religious freedom down to freedom of worship. Now you say, what's the freedom of worship? The freedom of worship is the freedom to believe what you want in the privacy of your own head, your own heart, maybe your own home, and your own house of worship. In other words, no one's stopping you from going to church. No one's stopping you from, praying to your imaginary friend in the sky. You hear this kind of definition of religious freedom when it comes to where, for example, religion fits in public education. When some of us say, look, we used to read the Bible in schools. In fact, early congressional leaders had the Bible printed, and they wanted all the school kids to be educated and that sort of virtue and that sort of thing. The response that often comes back is, no one's stopping that kid from praying if he wants to. Do you see freedom of worship? It's okay in a context of freedom of worship to believe what you want to believe privately. That's the same sort of freedom that they have in countries all around the world, even places like China, places like North Korea, places historically like Cuba, where as long as you keep your religion to yourself, as long as you keep your religious beliefs to yourself in your own head, your own heart, your own home, and your own house of worship, no one's going to bother you. That is not the sort of understanding of religious freedom that fosters something as brilliant and big as the First Amendment. That's not the sort of religious freedom that creates space for religious conviction across the board. You see, religious freedom is not just the right to believe what you want in a private sense. Religious freedom has always meant, and isn't religious freedom unless it means the right to order your life publicly around your deeply held convictions. And this is why Christians believe that religious freedom is not just a good thing for me, it is a good thing for humanity itself. Now, I wish I could have some time to get into this, but I'll give you one big outcome of that difference between freedom of worship and freedom of religion. A place where they allow you to have freedom of worship is a place where they can still make your highest loyalties and your highest commitments to the state. The genius of the American founders in creating this robust space for religious conviction, not only the right to believe what we want in our personal hearts, heads, homes, and houses of worship, but to order our public lives. It means that, you know what? It recognizes that this is a freedom that the government does not grant. This is a freedom granted by God, and it is a freedom recognized by the state. And in a free society, the reason that religious freedom becomes then such a catalyst for so many other freedoms, and this is something that I'm sure we'll get back into here as the night goes on, is that religious freedom means my highest loyalty is not to the state. My highest loyalty is to God, to my deeply held beliefs, to my conscience itself, that I'm more loyal to that than I am to the state. That doesn't mean there are no limits to religious freedom. Of course there are limits in order to have a society, and we can talk about that as we go ahead as well. But it's huge that a robust understanding of religious freedom protects the rights of individual citizens to actually be free in almost every other way, because our highest loyalties are not claimed by the state, it's claimed by God. The second way that religious freedom is misunderstood, the first is that it's defined down to freedom of worship. Increasingly today, and this is our challenge ahead, folks, is that religious freedom is dismissed as discrimination. You have to realize this, because I think those often making the case for religious freedom in the American context are pointing to all these stories, the stories of the names that I've already mentioned. And if you have the fundamental assumption and the right framework about what religious freedom is, these stories are outrageous. Of course they're outrageous. But I'm telling you that most Americans, or at least many Americans, particularly in positions of power, do not share that definition. When we hear religious freedom, like I did in 2009, I'm like, well, religious freedom, that's great. It's like American, like baseball and apple pie. The dominant narrative, particularly in academic context and political context, is that religious freedom is nothing more than a license to discriminate. It's a special permission to be a bigot. As long as that definition goes forward, we can't just point to violations of religious freedom and assume that everyone thinks and assume that everyone agrees that they're violations or that they're outrageous. We have got to do the really hard work. And it begins inside the church as well as outside the church. We've got to do the really hard work of re-catechizing this generation and the rising generation into what religious conviction is. That religious conviction is personal, but it's not private. It's a public confession of truths about life in the world that you personally commit to. And that these ideas belong in the public square, just like all ideas, because really the strength of the American context has been to recognize that religious freedom does belong in the public square, because those ideas belong just as much as any other in helping us understand how we can order society and solve our biggest problems. Thanks so much.
That was John Stonestreet presenting at the Summit Base Camp. Summit Ministries exists to equip students to be the next generation to represent Christ in the world. They have student conferences for ages 16 to 22, a Summit Base Camp for ages 18 plus, and then Summit Semester and Oxford Study Center for students who are 18 or older. For more information on Summit Ministries, visit summit.org. Again, that's summit.org. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast.